I mean, I've been covering tractor demos on Whitehall here for a year now, and that's the question. Look, the government is not backing down, so what is going to change?
Final week of December. Up to 150,000 tractors mobilized nationwide. More than 130 coordinated convoys within 48 hours. From before dawn, farming columns pushed toward Westminster, slowing 17 major routes into London as security zones expanded around Parliament. This time, the country did not turn against them. For many households, the message was understood immediately. Farmers were saying what others could not.
Do you think Keir Starmer understands farmers?
No, of course he doesn't. He hasn't got a clue, has he, half the time?
Full disclosure, I didn't vote for Labour. For me, I felt like nothing really was going to change under the Conservatives. They promised us a brilliant deal with Brexit, and now we're still trying to work out whether or not we're going to get any subsidies.
Months of rising fuel costs, shrinking post-Brexit farm payments, trade policies farmers say undercut British agriculture, all converging as the year closed. Outside, over 90 council and government buildings, rural anger became a national presence. It was pressure with public consent. As Britain prepared to enter a new year, farmers brought their demands directly to the center of power.
None of this lot here today were given, and I want to make that message loud and clear.
This is a very small demonstration of what we're capable of.
Don't go after farming.
I'll probably earn less than someone on the dole. You do it for love.
Signaling that agricultural policy could not roll forward unchanged. If these choices affect your future, staying with this story helps keep that pressure visible. This is Empire Alert News.
By mid-morning, police confirmed that farmer convoys were active across more than 120 approach routes nationwide, with thousands of tractors converging on political centers. In London alone, security conditions were altered across over 18 square kilometers as pressure built toward Westminster. As farmers reached secured approaches near Parliament, police repositioned lines repeatedly. Crowd control measures were activated as demonstrators attempted to move closer to restricted zones. Then came the moment that changed the tone of the day. Near a key access route into the parliamentary district, farmers unloaded more than 11 tons of potatoes, cabbages directly onto the roadway, spilling agricultural produce across police-controlled space. The potatoes were not thrown individually. They were dumped in bulk, transforming the street itself into a blockade. 11 tons. Enough to halt movement, enough to force immediate response, enough to turn food into confrontation. As the potatoes, cabbages spread across the road, objects including stones, eggs, and debris followed toward police lines. Officers reported multiple projectile incidents across several locations within a short period, prompting an escalation in public order response. Police deployed water and chemical deterrents to push demonstrators back and reassert control. Some protesters withdrew. Others remained in place, many equipped for prolonged exposure, indicating preparation rather than impulse. Throughout the morning, the confrontation repeated in cycles. Farmers advanced, police held. Pressure shifted. Fireworks were launched from within the crowd, no longer celebratory but disruptive. Further back, groups of demonstrators lit wooden pallets and bins, sending smoke across surrounding streets and reducing visibility near government buildings. By late morning, authorities confirmed that defensive lines around Westminster had been repositioned more than 20 times as pressure moved from one access point to another. The protest was not concentrated. It was distributed. The physical impact became increasingly visible. Police confirmed damage to over 60 temporary barriers, with several rendered unusable. More than a dozen street fixtures, including heavy planters positioned as security buffers, were displaced or destroyed. At least one tractor was recorded pushing aside a fixed planter near a secured entrance. Despite this, the protest did not thin. Tractors continued arriving from outside London, reinforcing positions as earlier participants rotated out. Police tracking showed that for every group withdrawing, another arrived, allowing the mobilization to sustain itself without escalation into full dispersal. Across the country, the same anger surfaced. Authorities confirmed farmer actions outside more than 110 council and government buildings nationwide, with tractors blocking access roads in multiple regional centers. In at least 34 locations, police presence was extended into the evening as gatherings exceeded planned durations. What unsettled planners most was duration. By nightfall, nearly 70% of deployed public order units had been active for over 10 hours without relief. Elevated security was extended overnight, with no clear endpoint established. This was no longer a protest defined by crowd size alone. It was defined by persistence and by symbols. 5 tons of potatoes on the street was not disorder for its own sake. It was a message. What farmers grow, what they sell, what they say policy is squeezing out of existence. Anger made visible. Anger made obstructive. Anger placed directly in front of power. By the end of the day, the protest had not forced an immediate political response, but it had forced something else. A full day, unresolved public order operation at the center of government. At the end of the year. And as tractors remained positioned near Westminster under tightened security, the message left behind by those 5 tons of potatoes was unmistakable. This anger was not passing through. It had decided to stay. The danger for government was never the protest itself. It was the timing. This confrontation did not arrive during a legislative battle or an election cycle. It arrived in the final days of the year, when political systems traditionally slow, when budgets are locked in, and when unresolved pressures carry forward into the next governing phase. That made farmers' anger harder to absorb, harder to delay, and far more expensive to ignore. By late December, the government of Keir Starmer was already operating under multiple constraints. Fiscal planning for the new year was largely fixed. Post-Brexit agricultural frameworks remained politically sensitive. Trade negotiations were active but incomplete. Any major policy recalibration now would signal instability. Yet doing nothing carried its own cost. What farmers exposed was not a single policy failure. It was accumulation. Years of tightening margins, rising fuel and fertilizer costs, post-Brexit payment uncertainty, and trade agreements farmers believe undermine domestic production, all converging at a moment when government room for maneuver was at its narrowest. That is why the protest was not treated as noise. It was treated as risk. Unlike short, high-energy demonstrations designed to peak and disperse, this mobilization showed every sign of being structural rather than episodic. Farmers did not arrive demanding immediate announcements. They arrived prepared to occupy time and space, and to carry pressure into the new year. From a government perspective, that changes everything. Pressure that arrives in December does not dissipate. It carries forward into January briefings, February budget recalculations, and spring policy fights. It reshapes the agenda before it is even formally reopened. Officials understood this. Internal assessments focused less on crowd size than on endurance. The use of tractors, the coordination across regions, the willingness to sustain presence. These were signals that the anger was not reactive, but organized. And crucially, it was socially legible. Farmers do not occupy the same political category as activist groups or partisan movements. They are widely viewed as producers, not disruptors. When they blockade streets with produce, when 5 tons of potatoes become the image of protest, the public message is not disorder, it is grievance. That distinction matters, because public tolerance for pressure remains high when protesters are perceived as speaking from necessity rather than ideology. In this case, the anger resonated with broader anxieties, cost pressures, supply chains, national resilience, and food security. For government strategists, that is a dangerous alignment. Attempts to frame the protest as disruption risked backlash. Attempts to ignore it risked escalation. And attempts to concede quickly risked opening the door to wider sectoral demands at a moment when fiscal space was already constrained. This placed the government in a familiar but uncomfortable position: delay without dismissal. By allowing the protest to run its course without immediate concessions, but also without decisive crackdowns, authorities attempted to manage the situation rather than resolve it. The goal was containment, not closure. But containment carries its own consequences, because anger that is managed rather than answered does not disappear. It reorganizes. It looks for leverage points. It waits for moments when pressure becomes unavoidable. The farmers' decision to mobilize at year's end ensured exactly that. Instead of allowing the government to reset in January with a clean agenda, the protest guaranteed that agricultural policy would enter the new year already contested. Every subsequent announcement, every trade discussion, subsidy adjustment, or rural funding review would now be interpreted through the lens of unresolved anger. This is the strategic effect of timing. It is why governments fear sustained pressure more than dramatic confrontation. A riot can be condemned and cleared. A protest that embeds itself into the calendar becomes part of governance. And that is what made this mobilization uniquely difficult. The protest did not ask for immediate answers. It demanded recognition. And signaled that absence of recognition would carry cost. By the time tractors began rotating out and security measures extended overnight, officials understood that the confrontation had already achieved something irreversible. It had shifted agricultural policy from background issue to frontline risk, not through one decision, not through one clash, but through anger that arrived prepared to stay, precisely when the system was least able to absorb it. And that is why this protest did not end with the day. It followed the government into the new year. The most dangerous outcome for any government is not unrest, it is familiarity. What unfolded with the farmers' protest did not end in immediate policy collapse, nor in decisive confrontation. Instead, it settled into something quieter and far more corrosive. Acceptance. Authorities adapted. Security adjusted. Traffic rerouted. Public messaging softened, and life, to a degree, continued. That is the normalization risk. When large-scale anger can occupy space, disrupt routines, and impose prolonged pressure without triggering resolution, it begins to rewrite expectations, not just for government, but for everyone watching. The farmers did not need to win in December. They only needed to prove that sustained pressure works. And they did, by remaining present without being dispersed, by forcing extended security operations without provoking a decisive crackdown. The protest established a new baseline. It showed that occupying political space, physically and temporally, is now viable. That lesson does not stay contained. Other sectors are watching. Transport workers, public sector unions, local authorities under budget strain, communities facing long-term cost pressures. What they see is not chaos. They see a method. Pressure that does not peak and fade. Anger that does not demand instant answers. Presence that lingers long enough to reshape the agenda. From a government perspective, this is profoundly destabilizing. Because once prolonged disruption becomes normalized, the cost of governance rises sharply. Every unresolved grievance gains an incentive to escalate not through intensity, but through endurance. And endurance is harder to manage than confrontation. A single riot can be condemned, contained, and politically closed. A protest that embeds itself into routine forces' continuous response, policing, messaging, resource allocation, without offering a clear endpoint. That is what makes it dangerous. It drains attention, it strains capacity, it accumulates political debt. Over time, the threshold for action rises. What once would have demanded immediate response now becomes background noise. And as thresholds rise, grievances must grow larger or last longer to be heard. That spiral is difficult to reverse. For the public, the effect is subtle but significant. Repeated exposure to disruption dulls shock. What once felt exceptional becomes expected. Detours are planned around. Security barriers are accepted. Political tension becomes ambient rather than alarming. At that point, anger no longer shocks. It settles. And settled anger is far more unpredictable than explosive anger. For farmers, this normalization carries its own risks. Sustained pressure can win attention, but it can also invite fatigue. Public sympathy, while strong initially, is not infinite. As disruption becomes routine, patience can erode, especially if resolution appears distant. That balance, between legitimacy and exhaustion, is where future confrontations will be decided. For government, the challenge is sharper. If pressure is allowed to normalize, authority quietly weakens. Not through loss of control, but through loss of finality. Decisions no longer close issues, they merely pause them. That creates a governing environment where every policy move is provisional, every reform contested before it even begins. And that is a dangerous place to enter a new year, because January is when agendas reset, budgets are interpreted, priorities are signaled. If the year begins with unresolved pressure already in place, the government does not start from neutral ground. It starts underweight. The farmers' protest ensured exactly that. Agricultural policy will now be negotiated under the shadow of precedent. Not just what farmers want, but what they have shown they are willing to do to be heard. That changes calculations permanently. The real question, then, is not whether this protest achieved immediate gains. It is whether it has quietly altered the rules. If sustained disruption becomes a recognized tool rather than an exceptional act, Britain may be entering a period where political pressure no longer arrives in waves, but settles into the landscape. And once that happens, restoring authority becomes far harder than maintaining it ever was. The farmers did not overturn policy in December, but they may have shifted something more fundamental. They demonstrated that anger, when organized and patient, no longer needs to explode. It only needs to stay. As the year closes, the streets are quieter again. The tractors have moved on, barriers are coming down, security levels will ease. But the pressure that surfaced in those final days of December has not gone away. It has simply slipped out of view. Britain enters the new year with the appearance of normality restored, schedules reset, political language softens, yet something fundamental has shifted beneath that surface. The farmers did not force an immediate reversal. They did not extract a last-minute concession. Instead, they changed the terms. They showed that sustained anger does not need to explode to be effective. It does not need chaos. It needs timing, organization, and the willingness to remain unresolved. That matters because January is when governments attempt to reclaim control of the agenda, to draw lines under the past year and move forward. This time, that line does not hold. Agricultural policy now enters the new year under pressure, not because of what was promised, but because of what remains unanswered. Every discussion on trade, subsidies, and rural costs will now carry the weight of what happened at the end of December. And farmers will not be the only ones watching. Others will have noticed the method, not the slogans, but the endurance, the ability to apply pressure without burning out, the ability to remain present without being dismissed. That is the risk. When sustained disruption becomes familiar, it stops shocking and starts shaping behavior. Authorities adapt, the public adjusts, and pressure quietly becomes part of the political environment. As Britain steps into the new year, the real question is not whether the streets stay calm. It is whether this moment becomes an exception or a precedent. Because once anger learns it can stay, it rarely chooses to leave quietly.